Forget the myth. The Wild West wasn't a land without rules. It was a land obsessed with them. Not just the unwritten codes of the six-shooter, but bizarre, petty, and often insane regulations etched into law books. This wasn't a frontier of freedom. It was a bureaucratic fever dream, a grand human experiment in just how specific and how stupid our attempts to control chaos can get. We're digging up the receipts. 1. The war on sitting. Imagine you've just survived a 14-hour cattle drive. Your bones feel like gravel, your throat's a desert, and you're caked in an inch of someone else's state. All you want is 30 seconds of peace. You slump onto the sidewalk in Galveston, Texas. Congratulations, cowboy. You're now a criminal. Galveston slapped a $10 fine, a king's ransom, on the revolutionary act of sitting down on the sidewalk. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was a blunt, anti-loitering weapon designed to keep the undesirables moving. It didn't matter if you were a weary traveler or a local merchant catching your breath. Your very presence, if not vertical and mobile, was an affront to civic progress. It was the perfect frontier greeting. Welcome to our thriving town. Now get up. 2. The Great Saloon Spit Take. The classic saloon was a hyper-masculine sanctuary, a temple built on sawdust, stale whiskey, and a thick patina of tobacco juice on the floor. For decades, the floor was the spittoon. Then, civilization arrived, and it was wearing a skirt. Towns began passing laws that would forever alter the frontier's most iconic institution. It became illegal to spit on the floor. This wasn't a sudden outbreak of concern for public health. This was about laundry. As respectable women's long dresses began dragging through the filth, the resulting dry cleaning bills held more power than any sheriff. The saloon was finally tamed, not by Wyatt Earp, but by the silently devastating economic power of a ruined hemline. 3. The Missile Crisis of Leadville. In the high-altitude chaos of Leadville, Colorado, lawmakers took a surprisingly broad stance against rowdiness. They made it illegal to throw missiles at any building or person. The genius of this law is its spectacular vagueness. A missile could be a whiskey bottle, a rock, or a bullet, but it could also technically be a snowball, a poorly aimed apple core, or a water balloon. The law didn't care about your intent, the potential for damage, or the context. It simply banned the physics of unauthorized throwing. It was a city council's desperate, all-encompassing attempt to outlaw bad decisions, essentially making it a crime to be drunk and clumsy with anything heavier than air. 4. The Kite-Flying Menace. Think of the most harmless, innocent pastime imaginable. A child on a breezy afternoon, flying a kite. In numerous frontier towns, this simple joy was deemed a public menace and an illegal act. Real ordinances banned kite flying within the city limits. This wasn't because they were a distraction or because the town elders hated fun, though they probably did. It was because they were a direct threat to the entire transportation system. That unpredictable, fluttering object in the sky was a silent predator to the equine nervous system, capable of turning a perfectly calm horse into a bolting, wagon-flipping instrument of chaos. In the Wild West, a six-shooter on your hip was normal. A child's toy in the sky was a threat to public safety. 5. The Fast and the Furious, 1880 edition. Long before the invention of the V8 engine, the Wild West had to deal with its first traffic menace, the reckless horse and buggy driver. In cities like Cheyenne, Wyoming, the streets were choked with the 19th century equivalent of sports cars. To combat this, the city enacted actual speed limits. It was illegal to ride or drive a horse faster than a moderate trot through the main streets. The fine could be up to $100, an astronomical sum that could buy a man a new horse. This was the birth of traffic law, a city's attempt to rein in the timeless, testosterone-fueled human urge to go just a little bit faster than everyone else, even when your vehicle is powered by hay. 6. The 8 p.m. curfew. The irony of the Wild West is staggering. A typical Tuesday in Prescott, Arizona, might involve a high-stakes poker game, a brawl in the saloon, and a casual gunfight breaking out before lunch. The adults were essentially untamable. So, what did the city council do? They decided to get strict with the children. By the 1880s, towns across the frontier had enacted rigid curfew laws, requiring anyone under the age of 16 to be off the streets by 8 or 9 p.m. While the town's pillars of society were busy losing their ranches at the faro table, the real civic concern was making sure little Jimmy wasn't out past his bedtime. It was a bizarre, almost touching attempt to impose order on the next generation, while the current one was still shooting at the saloon piano. 7. The unspeakable crime of not bathing. The romantic image of the Wild West is all dust, grime, and rugged individualism. But some towns decided to attack that image directly, with a bar of lye soap. In various frontier communities desperately trying to rebrand as civilized, ordinances were passed requiring residents, particularly men, to take a bath. The frequency was specified, at least once a month. You have to imagine a sheriff's duties expanding. It's not just arresting outlaws, it's conducting olfactory investigations. Sir, I have a warrant for your arrest and a strong recommendation for some soap. This wasn't just public health. It was a declaration of war against the cowboys' sacred right to smell like had been sleeping inside a cow for a week. 8. The Great Dust War. The single greatest enemy of daily life in a western town wasn't an outlaw. It wasn't a rattlesnake. It was dust. Relentless, choking, all-pervading dust. It got into your food, your water, your lungs. It was a constant, gritty reminder of the frontier's hostility. To combat this, towns like Tombstone enacted street sprinkling ordinances. These laws legally required every single business owner and resident to water the section of dirt road in front of their property at least twice a day. This wasn't a friendly, neighborly suggestion. It was a legally mandated, twice-daily war against airborne dirt, fought with buckets and barrels. Your civic duty wasn't measured in patriotism. It was measured in how much mud you could create. 9. Banishing the organ grinder. Life on the frontier was hard, and sometimes a man just wanted to hear some music. But a man's taste has its limits, and that limit was the organ grinder. These itinerant musicians, often accompanied by a sad, costumed monkey, were seen as the absolute nadir of public entertainment. They were a noisy, repetitive public nuisance. In response, towns like Butte, Montana, passed laws requiring them to buy an incredibly expensive license to perform, often $25 a month, a fortune at the time. This wasn't regulation. It was financial banishment. It was a law designed to make sure the only music you heard on the street was the comforting, familiar sound of spurs, saloon pianos, and occasional gunfire. 10. The Dandelion Sheriff. In the Wild West, you could get into trouble for cattle rustling, bank robbery, and lazy gardening. In Pueblo, Colorado, it was a literal crime against the city to allow a dandelion to grow within the town limits. This wasn't a polite suggestion from a 19th century homeowners association. It was a legally enforceable ordinance. You have to imagine a stern-faced lawman, the Dandelion Sheriff, patrolling the streets, his eyes scanning not for outlaws, but for rogue weeds. It shows a level of obsessive-compulsive civic pride that is both admirable and completely insane. Forget bandits. The real threat to Pueblo's public order was aggressive pollination. 11. The Anti-Treating Heresy. Picture the scene. A dusty cowboy swaggers up to the bar, slams a coin down and yells, "Around for my friends." It's the single most iconic gesture of frontier generosity. And in the Dakota Territory, it was a crime. Real anti-treating laws made it illegal to buy another person an alcoholic drink. The goal wasn't to destroy friendship, but to combat the rampant public drunkenness and political bribery that always started when one man decided to treat the entire bar. The law weaponized social awkwardness, forcing every man to sheepishly buy his own drink. It turned the most celebrated act of frontier camaraderie into a finable offense. Suddenly, the most dangerous man in the saloon wasn't the gunslinger. It was the guy trying to be nice. 12. The Profanity Tax. In the rough-and-tumble town of Deadwood, South Dakota, a person's honor was everything. But their vocabulary? That came with a price tag. A well-documented city ordinance made public profanity a finable offense. This wasn't just a general rule against being rude. It was a literal profanity tax. The city, in a moment of pure capitalistic genius, had monetized vice. You could curse all you wanted, as long as you were prepared to pay the city for the privilege. It transformed swearing from a moral failing into a simple financial transaction. In Deadwood, you could literally put your money where your mouth was. 13. The Cheater's Dilemma. Cheating at cards in a saloon was a fantastic way to get shot, but in some towns it was also a good way to get arrested. Places like Denver had explicit laws making it a misdemeanor to cheat in any game of chance. The punishment was usually a fine, a penalty far less severe than the frontier justice you'd get from the 250-pound miner whose money you just tried to steal. This law created a fascinating tactical choice for a discovered cheater. Do you take your chances with the sheriff, or with the angry mob you just fleeced? It was a law that offered a slightly better, though far less dramatic outcome than a bullet. 14. High-stakes civic duty. Forget horse races. The biggest gamble in the Wild West was the next election. Saloon patrons wouldn't just argue about who should be the next mayor. They would slam their life savings on the table to back it up. This turned civic duty into a high-stakes poker game, and lawmakers realized it was a catastrophic idea. Many territories flat-out outlawed betting on elections. The reasoning was simple and brutal. A man who has bet his entire ranch on a candidate's victory is no longer a voter. He is an investor, and he now has a very clear incentive to ensure his guy wins, whether by stuffing the ballot box, intimidating opponents, or worse. It was a rare moment of clarity, where lawmakers admitted that a bag of silver could easily outweigh a belief in democracy. 15. The Sabbath War. As dusty frontier outposts tried to rebrand themselves as respectable communities, they waged a holy war against Sunday fun. It wasn't just about closing the saloons, though that was part of it. Ordinances across the West made it illegal for theaters to hold performances, for stores to sell anything but absolute necessities, and, in many cases, for anyone to play baseball on the Sabbath. This created a silent, surreal landscape every Sunday, a forced day of piety in towns that were, for the other 6 days of the week, temples of vice and chaos. It was a legal battle between Saturday night and Sunday morning, and for 1 day a week, Sunday morning had the law on its side. 16. The Ugly Laws. San Francisco desperately wanted to project an image of a sophisticated, civilized city, but it had a dark secret written directly into its law books. Starting in the 1860s, a series of statutes known as the Ugly Laws made it a crime to be, well, ugly in public. This wasn't just subtle social pressure. This was the city acting as the world's meanest bouncer at the club of public life. If you were maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed, you were breaking the law simply by being seen on the street. Your very existence in public was a misdemeanor. It's a chilling, almost unbelievable piece of history, a reminder that some frontiers were meant to be closed. 17. The Great Pants Heresy. The Wild West was a place of rugged survival and back-breaking work. But for women, the fashion police of the Victorian era were never far behind. In numerous frontier towns, it was illegal for a woman to wear male attire, which specifically meant pants. Imagine trying to herd cattle, chop wood, or defend your homestead from rattlesnakes while wearing a corset and a massive skirt. This wasn't just impractical. It was a law designed to keep women in their place, even when their place was a mud-soaked ranch miles from civilization. It was a legal chain, ensuring that even as women proved they could do a man's job, they couldn't, under any circumstances, dress for it. 18. The Hypocrisy of Control. While the West was supposedly a land of opportunity, it was built on a foundation of brutal, legally enforced racism. One of the most widespread laws was the complete ban on selling alcohol or firearms to Native Americans. But here's the truly cynical part. This law was almost never about protecting anyone. It was a tool of control, selectively enforced to keep the native population at a disadvantage, yet frequently ignored by unscrupulous traders when there was a profit to be made. It was a law that managed to be both catastrophically destructive and breathtakingly hypocritical at the same time. A perfect snapshot of the frontier's moral compass. 19. The Bamboo Poll Tax. As the West grew, so did its prejudices, and they often manifested in bizarrely specific laws. In San Francisco, a city ordinance in the 1870s placed a special, expensive tax on laundries that didn't use horse-drawn carriages for their deliveries. This may sound random, but it was a precision-guided, legal missile. The law was aimed directly at Chinese laundry owners, who were known for delivering clothes by carrying them on foot with traditional bamboo poles. Laundries owned by white proprietors, which used wagons, were exempt. It was a law that didn't mention race at all, but its intent was crystal clear. A quiet, bureaucratic attempt at ethnic cleansing through taxation. 20. The Disinterment Ordinance. A person's final resting place is supposed to be sacred, unless, of course, that person was Chinese in 19th century California. A horrifyingly real state law from 1870, known as the Disinterment Ordinance, made it illegal to dig up a corpse without a special, expensive permit. This was aimed directly and solely at the Chinese community, who held a deep cultural belief in shipping the bones of their dead back to their homeland for final burial. The permits were, of course, prohibitively expensive by design. It was a cruel and targeted law, a bureaucratic weapon designed to attack a community's most sacred traditions, even after death. 21. Banning the barber pole. The red and white barber pole seems like a harmless, classic symbol. But in the 19th century, it was a very public reminder that your barber was also the town's surgeon, a man of razors, scissors, and very questionable medical theories. The red, in fact, was said to represent blood. As frontier towns desperately tried to rebrand themselves as sophisticated cities, this relic of a cruder, bloodletting time was bad for business. So they passed ordinances banning the poles, deeming them offensive to public decency. Think about the sheer absurdity. In a town where a gunfight might break out at any moment, the real, actionable threat to civic order was a striped pole's historical implications. 22. The Anti-Baby-Face Ordinance. Some laws are born of practicality, some of prejudice. This one, from El Paso, Texas, is born of pure, baffling specificity. City Ordinance 357 made it illegal to publicly exhibit any contortions or other actions calculated to frighten, excite, or amuse any baby. Let that sink in. Making a funny, got-your-nose face at an infant could, technically, get you in trouble with the law. This wasn't about protecting children from actual harm. It was about policing public behavior at the most microscopic, insane level. It's a law that makes you wonder what, exactly, was going on in El Paso that required an immediate, legal shutdown of Peekaboo. 23. The Buffalo Timetable. In Texas, it was illegal to shoot a buffalo from the second story of a hotel. It was also illegal to shoot them from a moving train. Now, this wasn't an early, enlightened attempt at wildlife conservation. The real reason was infuriatingly corporate. So many passengers were blasting away from the train windows in a recreational hunting frenzy that the trains were constantly having to stop for them to collect their hides. This was completely wrecking the schedule. The law wasn't about preserving a majestic endangered species. It was about preserving the timetable for the 315 to El Paso. The railroad always wins. 24. The Skunk-Skinning Sanction. Some laws you can understand just by imagining the smell that created them. In the booming cattle town of Fort Worth, Texas, a city ordinance made it illegal to skin a skunk within the city limits. This wasn't about animal cruelty or public health in the traditional sense. It was about olfactory warfare. You just know this law was passed a day after some trapper decided his front porch was the ideal spot for his pungent line of work, rendering an entire city block uninhabitable for a week. This wasn't just a law. It was a community's desperate, gagging plea for breathable air. 25. The Great Pig War. Life in a frontier town was an assault on the senses, but nothing quite compared to the pigs. In many burgeoning western cities, including Los Angeles, it was perfectly legal for pigs to roam the streets freely, acting as a sort of organic four-legged garbage disposal. This led to a very real and very smelly problem. So, towns passed ordinances making it illegal for a citizen to own a pig unless it was kept in a pen. This wasn't a public health initiative. It was a declaration of war against the oinking, snorting trash compactors that were turning Main Street into a mud pit and chasing respectable citizens off the sidewalk. 26. The Sacred Shade Tree. Picture a weary cowboy riding into a sun-scorched Texas town. He spots the only sign of life in the oppressive heat: a lonely, struggling shade tree on Main Street. The logical move is to tie his horse to it, right? Wrong. In many of these nascent towns, that very act was illegal. Trees were so rare, so precious, and often so painstakingly imported that they were considered vital municipal assets. And since horses had a destructive habit of chewing the bark, towns passed ordinances specifically forbidding anyone from hitching their horse to a public tree. It was the ultimate frontier irony, a law that made it clear the town's single patch of shade was more valuable than your horse. 27. The Canine Census. In the West, a man's best friend often came with a tax bill. Many towns, struggling for every possible source of revenue, instituted a dog tax. The laws were often surprisingly detailed, sometimes with a higher tax for female dogs than for males, in a crude attempt to control the canine population. Imagine a grizzled, trail-hardened cowboy who fears no man, having to sheepishly visit the town clerk to pay a $2 tax on his loyal cattle dog Scraps. It was the long, bureaucratic arm of the law, reaching into the one relationship a man thought was truly free. 28. The 24-hour Carcass Rule. With thousands of horses, cattle, and mules packed into dusty towns, the inevitable happened. Animals died, and they often died right there in the street. This led to brutally practical sanitation laws. In most towns, it was illegal for the owner of a dead animal to leave its carcass on a public street for more than 24 hours. The penalty was a stiff fine for each day the corpse remained. It was a law that created a very specific, very smelly, and very public deadline for every resident. It was the frontier's way of saying, your grief has a one-day grace period. Then, get a shovel. 29. The railroad's right-of-way. The railroad was the undisputed king of the West, and it wrote the laws to prove it. In cattle country, a common statute made it a crime to herd your livestock across railroad tracks at any point other than a designated public crossing. This sounds reasonable, until you realize that on the vast open range, the nearest public crossing could be 50 miles away. It was a law that completely ignored the reality of a cattle drive, forcing cowboys to choose between a 3-day detour or breaking the law. It was a perfect, arrogant example of corporate power dressed up as public safety. 30. The fish-based terror law. And then there's this. An Oklahoma law had a provision making it illegal to tie a fish to a horse's tether with the specific intent of frightening the animal. This is one of those rules that just stops your brain. Let's break this down. Who was doing this? Was fish-based equine terrorism a common prank? Was there a gang of outlaws who specialized in this bizarre form of psychological warfare against horses? The mind reels at the very specific, very strange series of bad decisions that led a group of lawmakers to sit down, debate, and finally decide, this is the problem that absolutely needs to be solved. 31. The Tombstone Gun Check. Tombstone, Arizona is famous for the OK Corral, a shootout that happened precisely because of a town law. Ordinance number 9 made it illegal for any person to carry a deadly weapon within the city limits. Upon arriving, you had to check your firearms at a hotel or livery stable. Think about that. The most legendary gunfighters in history had to go through a process as mundane as a coat check before they could go grab a drink. This law wasn't about abstract rights. It was about survival. It was a city's desperate, and ultimately futile, attempt to manage the deadly egos of the men who walked its streets. 32. The Etiquette of Violence. Dueling was the West's most famous and fatal method of conflict resolution. And while it was often illegal, the most interesting laws weren't about the duel itself. They were about the prelude. In many territories, it was a specific crime to send or accept a challenge to a duel. Lawmakers knew realistically they couldn't stop two determined, angry men from shooting each other, but they could at least try to outlaw the formal, gentlemanly invitation. It was a fascinating legal strategy that targeted not the violence itself, but the etiquette that led to it. 33. The price of honor. In the West, you could be forgiven for many things, but insulting a woman's honor was not one of them. While not always a written law, the unwritten code often gave a man the legal and social right to use violence to defend the honor of a female relative. If someone slandered your wife or daughter, you could shoot them, and a jury of your peers, all men of course, would almost certainly acquit you. It was a terrifying, informal legal code that placed a woman's reputation on a pedestal and a man's right to kill to protect it right alongside. 34. The Corpse-Looting Felony. Imagine you're riding the trail and you stumble upon a body, a victim of a gunfight or the harsh elements. His gun looks brand new. His boots are barely worn. In the brutal calculus of survival, taking them seems logical. Except that simple act of, let's call it, opportunistic recycling, was a specific and serious crime in many territories. Laws were enacted that made it a felony to remove personal effects, particularly boots and weapons, from a corpse. This wasn't a law about murder or robbery. It was a law against scavenging from the dead. It was civilization's desperate attempt to draw a line in the sand, establishing that even in the most lawless of places, your property rights didn't end when your heartbeat did. 35. The real estate of the dead. In the Wild West, dying was easy. Getting buried, however, could be surprisingly complicated, especially if you died in a booming mining town like Bodie, California. Real city ordinances often strictly forbade burying the dead within the town limits. But the reason wasn't sanitation or a respectful desire to create a quiet cemetery. It was pure, unfiltered greed. Every single square foot of ground was considered too valuable for prospecting to be wasted on a corpse. Your eternal rest was literally less important than the possibility of a few more ounces of silver beneath your coffin. It was the ultimate expression of frontier capitalism, a town so obsessed with finding treasure in the ground, it refused to put any in. 36. The brand police. In the vast open ranges of the West, a cow's brand was more important than the cow itself. It was a corporate logo, a legal signature, and a declaration of ownership, all burned into hide. Consequently, the laws against altering a brand were draconian. While stealing a calf might get you in trouble, being caught with a running iron, a tool specifically used to change one brand into another, was often a hanging offense, with or without a trial. It was the frontier's version of high-stakes corporate identity theft, and the punishment was absolute. 37. The Southern Horizon Clause. Property rights were sacred in the Wild West. But in Dodge City, Kansas, they took it a step further, into the realm of landscape aesthetics. A real city ordinance from the 1870s declared that no new building could be erected if it obstructed a citizen's view of the southern horizon. Why the southern horizon? Because that was the direction from which the massive, thundering buffalo herds appeared. Think about that. Your right to watch the spectacle of the hunt from your own front porch was legally protected. This wasn't just zoning. It was state-sponsored entertainment. In Dodge City, a front-row seat to the apocalypse was your legal right. 38. The passive-aggressive gate crime. Nothing captured the simmering, passive-aggressive tension between ranchers and homesteaders better than a very simple law. It was illegal to leave a gate open. On the vast, fenced-in territories, a single open gate could mean a rancher's entire herd would wander off, or a homesteader's precious crops would be devoured by stray cattle. It was the ultimate neighbor crime of the frontier. Prosecuting it was nearly impossible, as it was your word against theirs. But the law existed as a constant, simmering reminder that the greatest threat to your livelihood wasn't an outlaw with a gun, but a neighbor with a bad memory. 39. The race for water. In a land defined by its lack of water, the rules governing it were a matter of life and death. The guiding principle was prior appropriation, or first in time, first in right. This meant the first person to use water from a stream for a beneficial use, like farming, owned the rights to that amount of water, forever. This led to the absurd spectacle of ranchers and farmers literally racing each other, with shovels, to be the first to dig a ditch from a newly discovered creek. Your entire fortune could depend not on hard work or skill, but on whether you woke up 10 minutes earlier than your neighbor one Tuesday morning. 40. The law of mandated waste. The absurdity of the water rights system didn't end there. It had a use it or lose it clause. Under territorial law, if you owned the rights to a certain amount of river water but didn't use all of it in a given year, you could forfeit your claim to the unused portion. This led to the utterly insane practice of ranchers and farmers wastefully flooding empty fields or digging ditches that went nowhere, just to prove to the government that they were using their full water allotment. It was a system that legally required you to waste a precious resource in order to keep it. 41. The 10-foot hole to nowhere. Imagine a gold rush. Now, imagine that to legally claim your patch of land, you had to perform a specific, back-breaking, and often pointless ritual. That was the reality under the Discovery Shaft Rule. To make a mining claim official, A prospector was legally required to dig a hole at least 10 feet deep on their plot. This was meant to prove that they were serious and had found a mineral vein, but it led to the absurd landscape of mountainsides pockmarked with thousands of identical 10-foot deep holes, most of them containing nothing but dirt, sweat, and shattered dreams. It was the world's most exhausting and least effective filing system. 42. Attack on the Telegraph. The telegraph was the 19th century's internet, a fragile, magical wire connecting lonely outposts to civilization. And messing with it was a cardinal sin. In virtually every Western territory, it was a felony to damage a telegraph line. The punishment was often years of hard labor, potentially more than you'd get for robbing a stagecoach. This wasn't a law against simple vandalism. Tampering with that single strand of copper was seen as an attack on progress itself, a treasonous act that could isolate an entire community. It was the one piece of high technology you simply did not mess with. 43. The snake oil non-law. In the Wild West, anyone could call themselves a doctor. Let that sink in. There were virtually no laws requiring medical licensing or formal training. The man setting your broken leg might have been a bartender last week and a failed prospector the week before that. This terrifying lack of regulation meant that snake oil wasn't just a figure of speech. It was often the most advanced medicine you could find. The dumbest law in this case was the one that didn't exist. It created a medical free-for-all where the only qualification you needed to perform surgery was a strong stomach, a steady hand, and a talent for marketing. 44. The milk cocktail. In the rapidly growing cities of the West, fresh milk was a precious commodity. It was also, quite often, a complete lie. With no regulation, it was common practice for dairymen to stretch their supply with water, then add chalk for color, and even molasses to hide the watery taste. The problem got so bad that places like Denver passed laws specifically making it a crime to sell adulterated or unwholesome milk. This wasn't just a truth in advertising law. It was a city's desperate attempt to stop its citizens from unknowingly drinking a cocktail of paint, sugar, and whatever else was lying around the barn. 45. The marriage contract. In the West, getting cold feet before your wedding wasn't just socially awkward. It was a potential financial catastrophe. The legal concept of breach of promise to marry was taken very seriously. If a man promised to marry a woman and then backed out, she could sue him for damages. And juries, often deeply sympathetic to the jilted bride, would award massive sums. This wasn't about love. It was a business contract. A man's word was his bond, especially when that bond was a potential marriage license that could be converted, in a courtroom, into cold, hard cash. 46. The Chimney Inspector. In wooden boomtowns built practically overnight, the greatest killer wasn't a bullet. It was a stray spark. The fear of fire was so all-consuming that it led to hyper-specific laws. In many towns, it was illegal to have a stovepipe that passed through a roof or wall without being at least 5 inches away from any wood. Imagine a town marshal whose job included facing down outlaws, also having to carry a measuring tape to conduct chimney inspections. It was a law born from the terrifying, collective knowledge that one lazy carpenter could wipe the entire town off the map before breakfast. 47. The Swindlers Clause. In a transient society, skipping out on your hotel bill was a common and frustrating problem. To combat this, territories passed innkeeper laws that were surprisingly cunning. These statutes stated that if a person left a hotel without paying and without offering a good reason, the law would automatically presume they intended to commit fraud. The burden of proof was flipped. You weren't innocent until proven guilty. You were a swindler until you could prove you just forgot. It was a brilliant legal shortcut to stop the endless stream of dine and dash cowboys. 48. The Cigarette Prohibition. We think of the Wild West as an era defined by whiskey, gunsmoke, and chewing tobacco. But even then, they drew a line at selling certain products to kids. Long before nationwide bans, many Western towns had ordinances making it illegal to sell tobacco or cigarettes to anyone under the age of 16. It's a shocking, almost out-of-place moment of public health foresight. It seems that even in the most lawless places, they understood that some vices should at least wait until you were old enough to shave. 49. The original no-fly zone. No, not that kind. Before the airplane was even a dream, the original no-fly zone was established in Dodge City, and it targeted the common kite. But this wasn't the only law aimed at the sky. In Texas, it was famously illegal to shoot a buffalo from the second story of a hotel. These weren't just random bits of insanity. They were attempts to control a three-dimensional world. The kite law, also number 50, was about spooking horses. The buffalo law, number 4, was about passengers wrecking train schedules. Both reveal a world where the frontier wasn't just a horizontal line on a map, but a vertical space that needed its own ridiculous set of rules. 50. The lawyer ban. In the Wild West, getting justice was often a race against time. So much so that in the earliest gold rush camps, they legally banned the one thing that slows the legal process down the most: lawyers. That's not an exaggeration. In the highly effective, if informal, minors' courts, professional attorneys were often explicitly forbidden from speaking. Justice was decided on the spot by a committee of fellow minors who valued first-hand accounts and common sense above all else. Lawyers were seen as professional tricksters who would use confusing language and legal loopholes to obstruct the simple truth. It was a legal system built on the radical belief that the best way to find the truth was to kick the experts out of the room. The verdict: civilization's fever dream. So, there you have it. The final image of the Wild West isn't a lone hero silhouetted against the sunset. It's a town council meeting in a dusty room, furiously debating the legal ramifications of a dandelion. The frontier wasn't lawless. It was drowning in laws. It was a frantic, desperate, and often hilarious attempt to impose Victorian sensibilities on a landscape that simply didn't care. These 50 statutes are artifacts from a grand psychological experiment, a place where the terror of chaos met the madness of absolute control. They tried to legislate away ugliness. They tried to bill profanity. They tried to declare war on dust, kites, and poorly timed naps. What emerges is a portrait not of rugged individualism, but of panicked communities, obsessed with projecting an image of civilization they hadn't yet earned. They were terrified of fire, of undesirables, of bad smells, of their neighbors' pigs, and, apparently, of babies being amused too aggressively. These laws reveal the true, bizarre engine of American progress, a deeply held conviction that any problem, no matter how large or small, can be solved by writing a sufficiently specific and punitive rule. The railroad was a corporation that could bend the law to its timetable. A mining company's greed could literally dictate where you were allowed to be buried. A woman's honor was a piece of property a man could kill over, and a lawyer was a nuisance you could ban from a courtroom. The West wasn't one with guns alone. It was one with ordinances. It was carved out by men who believed in a manifest destiny that included the right to a clear view of the buffalo, but not the right to sit on a sidewalk. Today, we laugh at these rules. We see them as relics of a bygone, simpler, and, frankly, dumber time. But the impulse behind them is immortal. We're still passing laws to manage problems we don't understand, still trying to control social behavior with fines, and still convinced that public decency is a measurable standard. The Dandelion Sheriff is gone, but the zoning board that measures the height of your grass is his direct descendant. The Wild West isn't a historical period. It's a state of mind. It's the enduring, darkly funny, and slightly terrifying belief that if we just write one more rule, we can finally make this whole chaotic mess make sense.